themselves, but in the very words of the people who were participating in those meetings. I think this was a really stunning moment for the January 6th committee, Lester.
I felt watching that at moments, I thought of that meeting. Was the country rudderless at that moment? Danny, let me bring in your criminal defense attorney. What your thoughts about that meeting were?
In many ways, what we've seen so far is that Trump said some words, and those words really, the worst case against him is "will be wild." These were things that we already knew. Now you move on to these other things, like the meeting that we've talked about in the White House with no White House officials there until they come running in. That goes very far to showing that Trump, now we're getting to the point where Trump has to be at a level of ignorance that he doesn't know anything, that he has no idea how any protocol works. But ultimately, this case that we're going to hear today is about Trump said some words, and then some groups, militia groups, other groups, misguided followers of Trump reacted in a way that was totally over the top. And the committee's mission today is drawing a connection between Trump's words, whether he reasonably expected that it would result in violence. That's really it. That's the
This is not. I mean, again, this is not a criminal proceeding, but it's going to be wild. I could say, hey, I'm having a party. It's going to be wild. I don't expect people to be, beating on each other. Well, does that become an excuse why I didn't mean it literally?
Exactly right. I mean, you look at the words, and of course, context matters. You don't look at words, and courts don't look at words in a vacuum. But if Trump's intent was to incite violence, if he knew, now keep in mind, DHS officials were aware prior to January 6th that Trump supporters were responding in, let's say, violent or exaggerated or just overly ambitious ways to his tweets, to his words. So if Trump knew that, if DHS knew that, and Trump also knew that, then maybe a case could be made for "will be wild" means we want you to get wild. But look, that's not an easy case to make, which is why he hasn't been indicted yet, which is why the DOJ is still waiting to see what happens. Undoubtedly, they have more information than the committee does. They are just biding their time and seeing if anything comes out to make that connection. Because really, we've heard some new things today, but nothing so new that it amounts to Trump saying, go storm the Capitol. And until we hear that evidence, the DOJ is not going to be too wild to prosecute.
Hallie, where's this going?
Well, I think, I'm just struck by something that Danny said, too, this idea that was the former president ignorant, I think is the word you used, echoed what Liz Cheney, the vice chair, said in her opening statements. He was not an incompetent child. He was the president of the U.S. Where this is going, look at the two men on your screen here, two people that will testify to the level of extremism that two groups, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, two of the groups at the center of this, the insurrection, took, the steps that they took. What I'm going to be interested in here is what is the level of discussion or coordination, right, between those groups? We've seen some allusions to that. There has been an allusion to the involvement of members of Congress, for example, not with these extremist groups, but we know that some committee aides have been talking about that is something that will be laid out in part 2 of this hearing coming up. And then specifically, you think to that meeting, draw the link, right, between what we just heard in the last portion and what we're about to hear. Keep in mind who was in that meeting on December 18th, Mike Flynn. Okay, somebody who is considered a QAnon cult hero, essentially, this conspiracy theory on the far right fringes. That is a direct link, right, between that conspiracy and the Oval Office. You're going to see, I think, more of those links being drawn. And then also to hear from these men in their own words about the experience of, in the instance of Stephen Ayers, for example, being at the Capitol that day, what that was like, and any regret he may have now, as you know, Kristen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been getting text messages from some Republicans who are saying that so far today has been absolutely devastating for the president. That, of course, deals with the court of public opinion, not exactly what Danny is talking about, the legal proceedings that may or may not follow this. But I do think it underscores the fact that the first part of this hearing has set up what could be potentially even more damaging testimony from the rioter who we're going to hear from, Stephen Ayers. I go back to that image in one of the early hearings of them huddling in the parking lot near the Capitol in D.C. And I think those are the types of images of potential collusion and coordination that could be problematic in a legal proceeding.
Let me go to
and in a criminal investigation.
Pete Williams right now. Pete, what do we know about Oath Keepers and what their perceived role in all this was?
Proud Boys, really more than anything, Lester, faced the most serious charges of being the ones who sort of pushed people to go up to the Capitol. They were among the first to actually enter the Capitol building. So they faced the most serious charge of seditious conspiracy. Stephen Ayers, who will testify here, is so typical of, on the other hand, the largest group of people who came into the Capitol on January 6th. So far, the government has arrested about 860 people. About 260 of them are charged with doing something violent, resisting arrest, or assaulting police. The rest of them, about 600, in which Stephen Ayers is a member, were in the Capitol. He was there for about 10 minutes. They came up there, they saw people going in, they went in, they didn't do anything violent, and they left. And I think the reason you're going to hear from him is he says he was directly inspired by the president's tweet. He said on Facebook, January 6th, Washington, D.C., the president is calling on us to come back to Washington on January 6th for a big protest, and then he quotes the tweet. How much the White House knew about how much this tweet had illuminated through the radical fringes of American society, I don't think we know. Remember, the intelligence community didn't seem to have a very good heads up about what was coming on January 6th. And one other quick thing, Lester, you know, one of the gaps so far in the Justice Department's cases is, did anybody, and if the answer is yes, who had an actual plan to enter the Capitol? We know that these groups talked about storming the Capitol, about swarming around the Capitol, but whose idea was it, if there was a specific person, to actually enter the Capitol, or was it a matter of seizing the moment? We still don't know the answer to that.
Well, so some groups went directly to the Capitol as opposed to starting out at the rally?
Yes, although most of the groups did start at the rally. The Proud Boys were sort of an exception to that. They had a meeting at 10 in the morning at the Washington Monument, and that's where supposedly the last-minute instructions were given. And then, according to the government, the allegations in the government's indictment against the Proud Boys is that they were the pointy end of the spear. They led people up to the Capitol after the rally. They were the first ones to push through the police barrier. One of them is charged with actually being the first person to use a police shield to break out a window, and that's how the first people got into the Capitol. They got into a window, they got in, crawled in through the window, and then opened a door.
No way to know, but I'll ask you anyway. Any idea if the Justice Department watching this is seeing or hearing anything they hadn't heard before?
Well, I suspect there may be one or two things, but for the most part, the guidance we get is that the Justice Department is well aware of what the committee has found. I'm sure some of the quotes that they've heard, and some of the, perhaps I don't know whether they knew all of the back and forth about that fateful meeting inside the White House. But for the most part, I think, yes, the Justice Department is well aware of this.
Pete, thanks. A little delay. We're told they're having a little technical issue, but they've been, throughout these hearings, they've been extremely on time in terms of 10-minute break. Actually means 10 minutes, but they're having a little bit of technical issue, which gives us a little more time to talk about
I think you
this.
wished it upon us.
I guess I did. I said, we'll need 15 minutes. But Kristen,